Today I'll introduce digital makeup using masks and adjustment layers. I could use simpler tools, but this workflow is non-destructive, it is readjustable, and most importantly, these tools are available in any major photo editor. I'm using PSP 2020 because I experienced occasional slowdowns in version 2021. It has probably something to do with my setup. Anyway, everything works the same across almost all versions of PaintShop Pro. In the description of the video, you'll find a download link for the final image, usable in versions X8 to 2021. If you're watching on YouTube, you may also want to enable the auto-generated English subtitles. In the starting image, we can tell that the skin has been already smoothed out. It's like we have already applied primer, foundation and concealer. There are quite a few tutorials showing how to smooth the skin, how to remove blemishes, and how to conceal wrinkles, so we won't deal with these things today. We can also tell that the brows have been shaped with a faded brown shade. However, we can add some missing hairs here and there. All in all, we'll retouch the eyes with full makeup. We'll fill the brows with fake hairs. We'll boost a little the blush on the right cheek. And we'll punch up her lovely lips. We won't do any contouring, because it's been already done here, but we will increase the overall contrast as a final touch. So hopefully we'll go from this to this. Okay, I have opened my scratch image to work on, and the final image for reference. We'll start with the lips by changing their color, using an HSL adjustment layer. All adjustment layers come with their own mask, which is initially white, as shown in this thumbnail over here. This means that any change in the properties of this adjustment layer will affect the whole canvas, like so. If I invert the mask to black, with this little icon over here, then the adjustment layer has no effect. With masks, black means block, while white means let through. Put otherwise, black conceals, white reveals. We can also invert a mask from the Layers menu, or by hitting Shift-K on the keyboard. We can paint on the mask with white or black, thus showing or hiding the effect from specific areas. So again, right now the HSL adjustment is blocked, due to the black mask. But I can reset my materials to black and white, with this icon, then switch to my brush tool, and start painting the lips with white. The HSL effect shows only in the painted areas. And if I make a mistake, I can paint with black to fix it. When painting, the foreground and background colors correspond to the left and right mouse buttons, respectively. That's very handy when working with masks. We can also quickly swap the colors with this icon over here. One advantage of this technique is that we can change the HSL properties at any time, and they will affect just the white area of the mask, which of course we can also fine-tune with the paintbrush again at any time. So let me carefully paint the lips on the mask with white, using a soft brush, meaning setting its hardness to 0. This gives our strokes a smooth gradual fade around their edges. The opacity setting can be dialed down if we want to gradually build the HSL effect, with multiple strokes over the same area, which we do not want in this case, so I'm leaving it to 100%. To quickly adjust the size of the brush, we can hold down the Alt key on the keyboard, while dragging the mouse, with the left button kept depressed, like so. To quickly zoom in and out, we can use the mouse wheel, and we can pan the image by holding down the spacebar on the keyboard, while dragging the mouse around. Okay, let me quickly fine-tune our mask. Using a tablet pen makes things a little easier, but the mouse works fine too. Okay, good. It's now time to take care of the color. Back to the HSL properties dialog, we can modify the hue, the saturation, and the lightness. Usually I leave lightness to 0, and I adjust it with a separate curves or fill light adjustment layer. A little later, I'll show you when I also adjust this particular slider. The colorize option, over here, let us decide if we want to start from the original color of the lips, or from a colorless base. I prefer the latter, but the choice is yours. By adjusting just the saturation, we change the lips' vividness, without changing their hue. But I want them a little warmer, so I'm also dialing up the hue slider, just a little bit. To make sure that the adjustment layer will affect only the hue and saturation, I'm changing its blending mode to color, or color legacy. In this case I think I like the plain color blend a little better. Another option is to set the blend mode to multiply. This always produces a darker color, meaning we should readjust the HSL properties. When I use multiply, I usually also adjust the lightness slider, along with the hue and saturation. There is no right or wrong, it all depends on what looks we are going for. It also depends on the original color of the image. Keep though in mind that usually multiply is better for darkening, while color or color legacy is better for targeting specific colors. For this example, I'll keep the blend mode set to color, but feel free to use whichever works best for you. We're done with the lips color, so let's make them a bit more shiny now. First I will use curves, which is available in most major photo editing programs. Then I will showcase fill light and clarity, which is a bit more intuitive, but it's specific to PaintShop Pro. So we start by adding a new curves adjustment layer, with extreme settings, and we'll fine-tune them later. The adjustment affects the whole canvas, because its mask is currently white. With the HSL adjustment, we inverted the mask to black, hiding the effect, then we revealed it only on the lips, by painting them white on the mask. Since we want the same mask for the shine, we'll simply copy it from the HSL layer. PSP makes this harder than any other program I know, but it's still better than painting the lips all over again on the curves mask. With the HSL layer active, we select everything, then we float the selection. This copies the mask as a floating layer above the HSL layer, which we can now move above the curves, by dragging it in the layers palette. Then we defloat it and deselect. I strongly recommend learning the keyboard shortcuts for those 4 commands. They will save you tons of time. Okay, the mask of the lips has been copied now to the curves layer, so first let me set its blend mode to Luminance or Luminance Legacy, for the adjustment to affect only the shininess, not the color. Then we should fine-tune the properties. In case you are not familiar with curves, the 5 vertical lines of the grid correspond to contrast tones. From left to right we have blacks, shadows, mid-tones, highlights, and whites. Right now we have pretty much equated shadows to black, and highlights to white, meaning we have eliminated their intermediate shades. Hence the harsh outcome. We can add and remove points on the curve, to adjust the corresponding ranges. For this image, I'll reset the curve, then I'll boost just a bit the shadows, and a little more the highlights. And we are all set. Here's the before, and here's the after. Instead of curves, we can use a fill light and clarity adjustment, which is specific to PaintShop Pro. So let me first hide the curves and then add a fill light layer. Fill light brightens the darker areas of the picture, but that's not what we want in this case, so I'm leaving it at 0. What we want is to boost the brighter areas of the lips, so I'm going to adjust clarity and sharpness. Focus on the lips as I'm adjusting those 2 sliders, since we'll mask out everything else in a little bit. Okay, I'm happy with 38 clarity and 63 sharpness, so I'm committing the adjustment. It applies to the whole canvas due to its white mask, but we'll narrow it down to the lips by copying the curves mask to this layer. As we learned a little earlier, Ctrl A to select everything on the curves layer. Ctrl F to float the selection. Drag the floating layer above the fill light. Ctrl Shift F to defloat. And Ctrl D to deselect. I'm also changing the blend mode to Luminance Legacy, so it only affects lightness, not color, and here we have it. It looks even better compared to our curves adjustments, which we can of course readjust, but I won't do it now. In my experience, fill light and clarity adjustment layers may cause weird artifacts on the picture, especially after adding more adjustment layers. It happens randomly, and we can fix them by turning off, and then back on, the visibility of the layer, but in some cases I even had PSP crashing altogether. And with that, we're done with the lips. I renamed my layers to keep things organized, and I'm ready to do the eyes now. Let's start with mascara, using a new curves layer. I'm darkening the mid-tones as much as I can, without clipping the dark and the bright areas. Something like that looks fine. Then I hide the effect by inverting the curves mask to black. And I'll start painting with a white brush only the areas I want to darken. I keep hardness to 0, but I dial down the opacity quite a bit, because I want to gradually build the darkening, with multiple brush strokes. I set my brush size relatively large, but not too large, and I start dubbing the brush along the wet line of the eye. Notice how the skin around the lashes is also affected, and that's why I didn't want to clip the original dark and bright areas of the picture, in the curves properties. Don't worry too much about the skin darkening, because it will be blended with eyeshadow later on. In case of mistakes, you can either undo, or paint back the leaked areas with a black color. Okay, this looks fine. However, it also affected the inner eye, so I'm simply painting it black, to clean it up. Let me now also paint quickly the other eye. And there we have it. Here's the before, and here's the after. To boost the iris of the eyes, we can use another curves layer. This time we want to brighten them, so I'm lightening the midtones, just a little bit, like so. Again, I invert the mask, and I start painting around the iris, using a soft brush with low opacity, so I can build up the effect gradually. As we already know by now, white reveals, black conceals. Let me quickly shine the other eye too, and we are good to go. I'm also setting the blend mode to Luminance Legacy, to ensure that the curves will affect just the lightness, not the color. By the way, if we overdo it, we can always dial down the opacity of the whole layer, or we can readjust the curves properties. Or we can rework the mask itself, adjusting the brush opacity. And of course, these things work the same for any of our adjustment layers, not just this one. That's the beauty of adjustment layers and masks. Besides being non-destructive, we can always come back and readjust. Okay, here is the before. And here is the after. Time to add the eyeliner now. There are many ways, but I'll show you what I consider to be the most flexible workflow. It involves masking regular layers. Contrary to adjustment layers, PSP regular layers do not come with a mask by default. We need to mask them ourselves, but it's really easy. We start by adding a raster layer, and flood filling it with the color of the eyeliner. We can sample the color from the image, with the dropper tool, but I'll just use solid black here. Then we hit the mask icon over here, and we choose either show all for a white mask, or hide all for a black mask. We know by now that we can invert the mask later, but since I want to keep the eyeliner initially hidden, I'll choose directly a black mask. A new group is auto-created, containing our raster layer, and a new mask layer above it. This is how masks work with regular layers in PaintShop Pro. They are always grouped with the layer they mask. Other than that, they work exactly the same with their adjustment layer counterparts. We can paint on them with white or black, to reveal or conceal the underlying contents, which in this case is the eyeliner raster layer. Okay, I start with a rough outline of the eyeliner, using white paint on a soft thick brush, with full opacity. To fix errors, I use either black paint with the right mouse button, or undo. Just make sure you paint on the mask, not on the regular layer. To fine-tune my shape, I increase the brush size a little bit, and I start painting with black. This works like an eraser. Notice that I am now using the inner edges of the brush marquee. Combined with the increased size of the brush, it gives me a softer blend around the edges. But we'll improve the overall blending anyway, later on. If I erase too much, I can undo, or paint it back with white. As I mentioned earlier, a tablet pen makes things easier for this, but the mouse works too. It just takes a little more time. Alright, this looks fine for the purpose of this tutorial. Let me quickly do the other eye too, so we can move on. Okay, good. The next step is to blend the eyeliner a little better. Just dropping the opacity of the group layer gives a blunt blend, which I don't really like, so I'm leaving this at 100%. What I'm after is a nice smoky blend, so I'm switching back to the mask layer, and then I go to Adjust Blur, Gaussian Blur. Watch the eyeliner as I'm increasing the radius. I hope you agree it looks much better. To understand what happens here, let me first maximize the dialogue, and fit the whole mask to the preview window, like so. Now you can see a bit better how the radius affects the white area of the mask. Going too far will eventually turn everything black, and of course we don't want that. The bigger the radius, the bigger the blending. So we're really looking for hitting the sweet spot, depending on our picture. In this case, I think something around 2 or 3 looks good. We can also set the blend mode of the group to multiply, in order to make it darker, like so. And then switch back to the mask layer, and to the Gaussian blur dialog, and increase the radius a bit more, because darker content usually needs more blurring. Even then, we may get better results by also dropping the opacity of the whole group. It depends on the photo and personal preference. I'm undoing back to normal blend now. But in the final image, I used the multiply variant. I'm not sure if the flexibility of this kind of workflow is already apparent, but here's some more examples. To change the color, all we have to do is to flood fill the base layer. And we can change the blend mode of the group to something more appealing, like color or color legacy. And we can lighten or darken it by adding a curves or a levels adjustment layer on top of the base layer. We can recolor it with an HSL adjustment layer. We can even reshape it by painting on the mask layer. And of course we can make it even more smoky by blurring the mask layer and cleaning up the inner eye. The possibilities are almost endless. Gaussian blur is a popular blending technique, but sadly it is destructive in PSP. Nevertheless, We'll keep using it for the eyeshadow and the blush. Feel free to also try it on the lips color, and perhaps on the lips shine too. Okay, for the eyeshadow we start with a new HSL adjustment layer, adjusting the properties to our liking. To stay consistent with the final photo, I set hue to 334, saturation to 35, and lightness to 0. Then we set the blend mode to color legacy, so the adjustment affects only the color, not the lightness. And we invert the mask to hide the effect. We now start painting with white, in the areas we want to show the shadow on, and fixing errors by painting them black. We've done this so many times by now, so I'm speeding up the video. I focus on the eyelids and the area under the eyes, initially using a 100% opacity brush, but I'm adjusting it along with the brush size, as I go. Once we're satisfied, we can apply Gaussian blur to improve the blending. I'm using a pretty high setting for this one. The final step is to clean up the inner eyes using black paint, and maybe fine-tune the edges with a low opacity brush. And of course we can also adjust the opacity of the whole layer, and readjust the HSL properties. And here we have it. To extend the eyeshadow towards the brows, we can either rework the existing layer, or add another one, as I've done in the final photo. This way I can edit them separately. The technique is exactly the same, so I won't repeat it here. Avoid painting over the brow highlights, because they contribute to the overall contouring of the face. If you're going for a smoky eyes look, you can change the blend mode of either or both shadow layers to multiply. And then readjust their HSL properties, the layer's opacity, and maybe also rework the masks. And with that, we're pretty much done with the eyeshadows. Another HSL adjustment layer can be used for blush, below the eyeshadows. I'm dialing up just the saturation to make the existing color pop up. The blend mode of blush layers are usually set to multiply, but again it depends on what looks we're going for. Invert the mask and we're ready to paint the blush onto the cheek. We want a big soft brush for this, but we don't really paint with it. Usually just a dab is all we need. Feel free to undo and readjust the brush size and opacity, until you get it right. Okay, I'm happy with this one, so I'm cleaning up the areas the blush was not supposed to leak on, by painting them black. By the way, if you experience delays while brushing, increase the brush step setting, over here. Improve the blending with Gaussian blur, and dial down quite a bit the layer opacity. If needed, also readjust the HSL properties. These are the settings I've used in the final photo. This is a very subtle change, because I only wanted to even out the blush. In my opinion, her left side was lacking just a little bit. Anyway, here's the before, and here is the after. In the final photo, I have also fixed the highlight on her left side, because to my eye, it looks a bit harsh. It's a new raster layer above the blush, called Blush Highlight Fix. I'm probably nitpicking, but I'll show you really quickly what I did, without finishing it off here. Add a new raster layer, then switch to the Push tool brush, making sure that Use All Layers is checked. This means that the brush will pick whatever information is present on all layers. Drop both opacity and hardness to a very low setting, and start carefully pushing the skin color into the highlight. I'm using quite a small brush size for this, undoing often, until I get it right. Take your time, and feel free to readjust opacity, hardness, and size as you go. By the way, the push brush can also prove handy as a wrinkles concealer. Time to add some fake hairs into the brows. We could use the clone brush to copy existing hair or download special brushes. But today we'll make our own hairs. And it will only take us a few minutes. This is definitely easier with a tablet pen, but here I'm using a regular mouse. We're going to need the brush Variance palette, which I have already pinned on the side of my workspace. You can open it from the Palettes menu, or from the View Palettes sub-menu, or by simply hitting the F11 key on the keyboard. We start by adding an empty raster layer for the fake hairs, and we then sample a dark color from the existing brows with the dropper tool. Just make sure that Use All Layers is checked, else it will try to sample from the current layer, which is of course empty. I keep the sample size at 1 pixel, to target the exact color I'm going to click on. The other options use the average of the surrounding pixels, but anyway, it's not super important in this case. Okay, by default, brush strokes realize their defined settings at a steady rate. The brush size, for example, stays the same across the stroke. However, when I change the size variance to fade out, in the brush Variance palette, the brush stroke gradually narrows as I go, giving us this pointy ending. We can even prolong or delay the fade, by adjusting the fade rate. The other thing to take care of, is the harshness of the pointy ending. Back to the brush Variance palette, we also set the opacity to fade out, and we now have a much more uniform result. If you're using a pen tablet, you can assign your brush variance attributes to any of the functions listed with an asterisk in front of their name. For this particular photo, I'll use a really small round brush, with the size set at 3, hardness at 0, and 90% opacity. In the brush Variance palette, I've set size and opacity to fade out, with a 50 pixels fade rate. Of course, different photos and devices need different settings, but these work okay for me here, using the mouse. I'm trying to paint the hairs with very short strokes, targeting sparse areas. I know it looks ugly right now, but we'll take care of that a little later. To fix mistakes, we can undo or use the eraser tool. And if we want to start from scratch, we can always clear the whole layer by hitting the delete key on the keyboard. Okay, I'm speeding up the video so you don't get bored. That's what I came up with, and yes, it looks terrible. But once I dial down the layer opacity, things get so much better. We can define the hairs even more, by changing the blend mode to multiply, and probably also readjust the layer opacity. There we go. Here is the before. And here is the after. Quite a difference, don't you agree? Remember to reset the brush variance settings to their default values, with this little icon over here. Else they will stay in effect every time you use the paintbrush tool. We can also punch up the contrast of the whole picture, with another curves layer. Just a final touch, nothing crazy. A tiny boost to the mid-tones is more than enough for this particular photo, or so I think. This was quite a long video with lots to take in, but I hope I didn't bore you. Check out the description below for a better method of copying masks, which I discovered after recording the related part of the video. You'll also find a download link for the final image. Thank you very much for watching.